With the recent closure of Anthem, I think it is very appropriate to take a closer look at what really went down with the game, what it aimed to achieve, and where it ultimately fell short. On January 12th, 2026, Anthem was officially closed down by EA, and with the servers taken offline, the game did not merely lose live service features, but ceased to exist as a playable service altogether. Anthem originally launched in 2019 as an online action RPG developed by BioWare, a studio historically associated with narrative-driven single-player games. They have previously done work on titles such as Mass Effect and Dragon Age. With recent releases from this studio, it begs the question how the studio is still alive, but that is another question for another video. Anthem placed players in the role of so-called freelancers, elite pilots equipped with powerful exosuits known as javelins. Tasked with surviving and protecting a hostile, ever-changing world, Anthem was designed from the ground up as a shared online experience, blending cooperative gameplay, loot-based progression, and a persistent open world that was meant to evolve over time through updates that would be released later on after its initial release. They were planned on various different events. There were big story expansions they wanted to introduce along the lifetime of this game. The Javelin's available play was the all-round ranger that you initially start the game with, the tank Colossus, the magic class Storm, and the nimble and fast-paced Interceptor. At its core, Anthem aimed to position itself as a live service looter shooter, but with BioWare's signature layered storytelling on top of it. On paper, this combination was intriguing and compelling in practice. It proved difficult to achieve, however. To Anthem's credit, there were elements that genuinely worked. The most universally praised aspect of the game was its flight system. Flying a javelin felt really fluid and fast as well as fun. It was seamlessly blending the traversal and combat in a way that actually few games managed to achieve. Movement across the world was not just functional, but actually very enjoyable, and it gave Anthem a distinct physical identity within the genre. Visually, the game also stood out. Its open world environments were lush and meticulously crafted and intriguing, providing immersive atmospheres and dense jungles, dramatic weather effects, and large-scale ruins. The world felt like it was built around movement rather than just static encounters, and it was really reinforcing fantasy of being a agile, heavily armored pilot rather than a grounded player character. The Javelin classes themselves were another strong foundation. Each suit had a clear role and a clear playstyle tied to them, encouraging cooperative aspects, synergy, and team composition in a multiplayer session. Anthem also attempted to establish a broader narrative universe. The lore surrounding the freelancers, the shapers, and the catastrophic forces shaping the world hinted at a deeper story, and while much of it remained underdeveloped, the ambition was quite clear. The intention was clearly to let the narrative grow over time alongside the narrative live service structure, as is typical for games centered around longevity. However, these strengths were overshadowed by the range of fundamental issues that the game had. The most obvious criticism concerned the gameplay loop. Missions quickly became repetitive, often following the same structure of traveling to an area, defeating waves of enemies, collecting objectives, and returning to the hub. There were not a lot of variation in mission degree, but over time, the novelty of the flight mechanic and combat could not make up for the lack of meaningful diversity in the gameplay. Another thing was the loot system, cornerstone of pretty much any looter shooter and another major weak point of this game. Item drops that were frequently uninteresting, poorly balanced, or confusing in terms of stats as well as their impact. And progression ended up feeling quite inconsistent, and the connection between effort and reward were weak, really just undermined the player's long term motivation for playing this game. For a game that was built around grinding and repetitively completing missions and running these objectives, this was a major mistake. Anthem also struggled with a lack of compelling endgame content. Once the main story concluded for the players, they were left with just a few engaging activities that actually justified a continued investment of their time. The BioWare team promised updates and expansions, but that was all later delayed, scaled back, or just quietly abandoned. And that really hurt the players' trusts and reinforcing the perception of a game that clearly lacked a long term plan. At launch, technical problems further damaged the game's reputation. There were bugs and crashes, there were long loading times, and performance issues were very common. And although some of these problems were addressed over time, the initial impression were very difficult to overcome. And more broadly, Anthem suffered from what could be described as an identity crisis. It never really committed to being a deep RPG or a pure shooter or a live service platform, and that resulted in a very fragmented experience that really felt unfocused. And now, after the closure of Anthem, the executive producer Mark Dera, who worked on quite an extensive amount of time on this project, he uploaded a video actually going over how messy and unstable the project became behind the scenes, and he's very vocal and open about it. And so I just quickly wanted to show the video, and I'm not gonna go through the whole thing because it is quite an extensive and actually very informative video. So I would highly recommend you checking it out yourself. And I just have it pulled up here. Around 1 hour, he has this whole checklist going through every detail that he finds very interesting to the project. And as I said, you can definitely learn a lot from this video, and he pretty much goes through the entire history of the project. And what's very interesting from this video is that one of his main points is that Anthem actually struggled for years on settling what it wanted to offer the players and what it wanted to be as a product. He mentions that decisions were either delayed or completely undone or just constantly revisited. And teams ended up working in what can be described as silos within the organization, where none of them had a shared direction and operating independently with limited coordination and poor information flow across the teams and across the project in general. Another major point that I want to talk about is that he also mentions a lot of secrecy behind the project, which made it even worse. Information was kept tightly controlled, which might work when a team is small, but as Anthem grew, it made alignment harder and allowed half finished ideas to survive longer than they really should have. So instead of moving toward a clear path and making these decisions and building on them, the project kept drifting, and core features were added, removed, and then later re added as the vision kept shifting. Now, there was a article by Games Radar as well, and some of the points that are in the video is also in this article, so I quickly wanted to show that as well. We have this article from Games Radar, and a very interesting quote is that Anthem did permanent damage to the careers of a lot of devs, and he's not sure he or BioWare ever came back from its spectacular failure. And this is actually a very interesting short article going through how BioWare's reputation was damaged, and we've seen it in the later discussions of the very debated Dragon Age Veilguard that launched to quite a mediocre reception from the gaming public. It wasn't really a compelling story or gameplay in general of the game, and people kept referring back to Anthem as well. And now, another interesting thing is actually if we scroll down just a bit, he does mention a particular quote that's actually quite interesting. And it says here executive producer Mark Dera, who held the same role on Dragon Age Origins 2 and Inquisition, has been brutally honest about the game and its development in the past. He previously acknowledged that a few months before launch, the devs knew they were targeting a Metacritic score in the 70s rather than BioWare's usual target of the 90s. So, with what we know now, the struggled development of the game and going back and forth on decisions and not settling completely on what the game was supposed to envision and entail. The ultimate decision to shut down Anthem was therefore not very sudden, but the result of declining engagement and diminishing player confidence, as well as increasingly unstable live service model. However, with these problems being said, there was actually a brief moment of hope for the game, and in an attempt to save the project, EA and BioWare announced what would be called Anthem Next, a reboot that was meant to fundamentally rethink the game, and the goal was to revisit core systems such as the loot and progression and the in-game structure, and finally give the game a clearer sense of identity that it previously lacked. And at its core, Anthem Next was meant to be an opportunity to step back and reassess what the game actually needed to be, and especially reassess what players had experienced rather than what was originally envisioned. In reality, however, Anthem Next never really moved beyond and the early concept stages, as well as the internal discussions, because while developers shared occasional updates and early ideas, no substantial or, for that matter, playable versions were ever really put into players' hands. Rather than functioning as a space for experimentation, iteration, or learning from player behavior, the reboot remained pretty much in lockdown and stayed in early concepts and internal assumptions. And back in 2021, EA officially cancelled this project, effectively sealing Anthem's fate long before the servers were eventually shut down. And looking back, it is difficult not to see alternative paths that might have led to different outcome. Anthem may have benefited from a more exploratory approach early on, starting smaller, testing core ideas in isolation, and gradually refining them based on how players actually interacted with the game. Could have benefited from launching as more of a focused single player or smaller scale co-op experience where it could have created more room to experiment with movement, combat, and progression before layering on top long-term service mechanics. And instead, the game ultimately fell victim to bureaucracy and mismanagement of resources and early design assumptions that became too locked in too quickly, leaving very little room to adapt once real player feedback was given. And so Anthem's complete removal from play also raises the broader questions within the game industry. Initiatives such as the EU-based Don't Kill Games movement argue that when online games are shut down, developers should be required to leave them in a state that would allow playable offline or single player services. And if we look at it from this perspective, Anthem represents more than just a failed live service experiment. It is a case where a game was treated purely as a live service rather than a product that players continue to explore, learn from, or later return to. And in the end, Anthem stands as an example of what can happen when developers move faster than understanding without enough room to test ideas, learn from users, and adjust the direction early. And because of that, even strong concepts can collapse under their own weight. And when the service ends, nothing is left behind, not even the chance to experience what the game once tried to be. So, in the end, ultimately, Anthem will likely be remembered less of what it actually managed to achieve and more for what it promised. It was a project driven by strong ideas, impressive technology and mechanics, and genuine ambition, but ultimately fell victim for structural misalignment and executional flaws. Its shutdown is not just the end of a game, but an example about the risk of building entire experiences around the service that can be turned off, leaving nothing behind. But with that being said, I don't really have anything more to add to this as of this stage. Once again, I do highly recommend you check out the video made by Mark Dara, as it really covers some very interesting aspects of this development of a game that really made people excited to play around when it was first revealed. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment on what your experience was with this game. Did you play it, or didn't you care about the game, or just in general, if you have any opinions of the game, I would very much like to read them. That's gonna do it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and see you next time.